What was the toughest for you? What do you think, Nick?
It wasn't very tough. I mean, it was pretty.
Stop scrolling for 1 second, because the headline version of this story is clean, tidy, and almost polite. 2 names, 1 neighborhood, 1 tragedy, and then the internet moves on. But the real version is not polite. Rob Reiner and his wife, Michele Reiner, were found dead inside their own home in Brentwood. Not in a movie, not in a script, not in some distant place where danger feels abstract. In the kind of home you're supposed to be safest in. And the most haunting detail isn't even the location. It's the fact that their own son, Nick Reiner, has been charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Let that sit for a second. Because when a story like this breaks, the world immediately reaches for explanations that feel easier to swallow. A misunderstanding, a breakdown, a tragic accident, anything that turns horror into something soft enough to carry. But law enforcement didn't call it an accident. The deaths were ruled homicides, and this case has already moved into the legal system with a clear next step. Nick's arraignment is scheduled for January 7th, 2026. And here's the part most people aren't ready to talk about. This is not just a celebrity death story. This is a family collapse story. The kind that forces every parent watching to quietly ask themselves one terrifying question. If love is supposed to protect your home, what happens when the danger is already inside it? In the days after the news broke, statements began to surface, not from Hollywood's loudest voices, but from the people left standing in the wreckage. Rob and Michele's children asked for privacy and compassion while they grieve, and confirmed a memorial will happen later. That might sound routine until you realize what it really means. It means the family is trying to bury 2 people they loved while the world turns their nightmare into content, headlines, debates, and comment wars. And it means the story is still unfolding, because as the court date approaches, every new document, every new report, every confirmed detail will sharpen the question everyone's avoiding. How did it get this far? Here's what makes this case feel so suffocating. It didn't begin with sirens, it began with silence. On Sunday, December 14th, something as ordinary as a scheduled visit turned into the moment everything broke. A massage therapist reportedly arrived at the Reiner's home and couldn't get anyone to answer. Calls went unanswered, the door stayed closed, and that's when their daughter, Romy, was contacted. What happens next is the kind of detail that sticks in your throat. Romy went to the house, she entered, and she reportedly saw her father's body. She ran out, and the emergency call was made. When first responders arrived, they found 2 people dead inside the home. 2 lives gone. Not injured, not critical, gone. Authorities would later rule both deaths as homicides, and the medical examiner released a stark, clinical phrase that somehow makes it even more horrifying: multiple sharp force injuries. And then, days later, paperwork added chilling precision. The death certificate indicated both Rob Reiner and Michele Reiner died within minutes of being injured. Minutes. The kind of time window that leaves you imagining panic, fear, and the brutal speed of the moment. They were found just 1 minute apart. And while the world was still trying to process the word homicide, the investigation moved fast. Later that same day, their son, Nick Reiner, was located and arrested near the University of Southern California area. Not weeks later, not months later, that same day. By Tuesday, the Los Angeles County District Attorney announced the formal charges. 2 counts of first-degree murder, not lesser charges, not vague language, first-degree murder. Prosecutors also filed what are called special circumstances, including the allegation of multiple murders, plus an allegation that a deadly weapon was used, described as a knife. Those additions matter because they can raise the legal stakes to the highest level. And then came the courtroom moment that felt like a warning flare to everyone watching. On December 17th, Nick made a brief first court appearance. He didn't enter a plea. His attorney waived the right to a speedy arraignment, and the arraignment was continued to January 7, 2026. Outside the courthouse, the defense described the situation as involving complex and serious issues that needed to be handled carefully. And in the middle of all this, the family tried to draw one boundary that the internet always wants to destroy. Rob and Michele's children released a statement thanking people for the love and condolences, but asking for privacy and compassion, and for speculation to be tempered with humanity. They also said a memorial service would be held at a later date. That request matters because it tells you something important. Even as the public demands answers, the people closest to this tragedy are still trying to survive it. Now, let's be honest about what we still don't know. We do not have every detail of what happened inside that house. We don't have a full public motive. We don't have the full chain of moments that turned a family home into a crime scene. And that's exactly why this story keeps pulling people in. Because when the why is missing, the human mind tries to invent it. But this case isn't a mystery show. It's real life. 2 people are dead, a son is charged, and a court date is coming. In part 3, we're going to step back and talk about who Rob and Michele were to the world, what their life looked like behind the fame, and why this tragedy hit Hollywood like a punch to the chest. To understand why this story hit people so hard, you have to understand what Rob and Michele represented long before the headlines. Rob Reiner wasn't just a celebrity name on a mailbox. He was one of those rare Hollywood figures who felt permanent, like someone who had already earned his place in the cultural memory of America and would simply keep going, quietly working, quietly aging, quietly living. A man who helped shape what millions of people think love looks like, friendship looks like, courage looks like. He started out in front of the camera playing the loud, stubborn, unforgettable Archie Bunker's son-in-law on All in the Family. But it wasn't acting that turned him into a legend. It was what he did next. He stepped behind the camera and became a storyteller who could make you laugh 1 minute and hold your breath the next. The kind of director whose films didn't just entertain you, they stayed with you. He helped give the world Stand By Me, a story about boys on the edge of childhood, walking towards something they don't fully understand. He brought to life The Princess Bride, a film that generations grew up quoting like scripture because it made romance feel brave and playful at the same time. He directed When Harry Met Sally, a movie that didn't just ask whether men and women can be friends, it made people argue about it for decades. And then he did Misery, and A Few Good Men, and so many more. Different genres, different tones, but always the same fingerprint. Human emotion, human tension, human truth. That's why the shock of this case feels so surreal, because people look at Rob Reiner's legacy and they think, a man like that must have lived a life that made sense. And then the news arrives and says, no, not even here, not even in this kind of home, not even with this kind of family and Michele Singer Reiner. In most celebrity stories, The spouse becomes a footnote, a name on a line, a shadow next to a brighter star. But those who actually followed Rob's life knew Michele was not a shadow. She was part of the structure, the steady presence beside him, the person who shared that long middle stretch of life that no one applauds. The years where you're not building a career anymore, you're building a home, building routines, building a family culture, building the kind of private world that the public never gets to see. And that's what makes this tragedy feel so intimate, even to strangers, because it didn't happen at a red carpet event. It didn't happen on tour. It didn't happen in a place where danger is part of the job. It happened where dinner might have been planned, where a phone might have been charging on a counter, where the air might still have held the normal smell of home. And now that home is defined by something else, a crime scene, a timeline, a set of injuries described in the coldest possible words, and a son charged. If you listen closely to how people reacted when the news broke, you hear the same emotion again and again. Not just sadness, disbelief. Because when someone like Rob Reiner is taken in a violent way, it forces people to confront a truth they hate admitting. Fame can't protect you from family tragedy. Money can't protect you from the person who knows where the door is unlocked. Success can't protect you from whatever darkness might grow behind closed walls. And the most unsettling part is that we still don't have the full story of what the home life looked like in the days before this happened. We don't know the private conversations, the unspoken tensions, the moments that felt small at the time but may have mattered later. We only know what the public knows right now. 2 people are dead. A son has been charged with first-degree murder, and the court process is moving forward. Now the story has a face, not Rob's, not Michele's, Nick's. Because once prosecutors filed charges, the public's attention shifted the way it always does. In a tragedy like this, people stopped asking what happened and started asking who. Who is the son charged with killing 2 people the world admired? Who is the person prosecutors say is responsible for a stabbing inside the Brentwood home? And who is Nick Reiner beyond the mugshot and the courtroom schedule? Here's what's been publicly reported so far. Nick is 32 years old. He grew up in the shadow of a famous father, in a family the public thought it understood. But Nick wasn't just Rob Reiner's son in a tabloid sense. Years ago, he'd stepped into the world of storytelling too. He co-wrote a film called Being Charlie, a story shaped by addiction, recovery, and the way family love can feel like a lifeline and a battlefield at the same time. Rob directed it. Nick helped write it. The project was described as loosely connected to Nick's own struggles, and Nick openly spoke in past interviews about how hard those years were. He talked about addiction starting when he was a teen. He talked about rehab again and again. He talked about homelessness. Imagine that for a second. A young man carrying a famous last name, yet still describing nights on the street like they were part of his life story. It's the kind of contrast that makes people uncomfortable because it doesn't match the fairy tale version of celebrity families. And he also spoke about something else that matters now more than ever. He spoke about how he didn't bond much with his father growing up, how they felt different, how they didn't connect the way people assumed they would. That doesn't explain what happened, but it does reveal something the public rarely sees until it's too late. The private distance that can exist even inside a famous home. Now here's where the story becomes even more volatile because in the days after the charges, multiple outlets began reporting that Nick had been dealing with serious mental health issues, including reports that he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and was receiving treatment. Let me be careful with this next part, because this is where the internet gets cruel. A reported diagnosis is not a verdict. Medication is not a motive. Mental illness is not a synonym for violence. And none of this changes the central fact that 2 people are dead and a son has been charged. But if those reports are true, they could become a major part of what happens next in court, because cases like this are often not only about what happened, but about what someone's mind was doing in the hours and days leading up to it. And that's exactly why the defense attorney's words outside court hit so hard. He called the issues in the case complex and serious. That may sound like legal language, but it also sounds like a warning. It suggests this is not going to be as simple a story with a simple explanation that fits neatly into a headline. Right now, the most important thing to remember is this: Nick has not entered a plea. The case has not been tried, and the only thing the public has is the outline of what authorities have said so far. Charges, special allegations, a deadly weapon described as a knife, and an arraignment date set for January 7, 2026. Everything else is still unfolding. And here's the part that breaks people in half emotionally. Because no matter what comes out next, you can't escape the same image. 2 parents inside their home, a family shattered, and a son standing at the center of it, whether by guilt, illness, or something the public still can't fully see. What chills people about this case isn't only what happened, it's how normal the day looked, right up until it didn't. Because when you strip away the celebrity names, the legal language, the headlines, what you're left with is something painfully ordinary. A Sunday, a home, a routine appointment on the calendar, and then no answer. Public reports say a massage therapist arrived at the Reiner's Brentwood home on December 14th and couldn't reach anyone. No response at the door, no response by phone, just that unnerving kind of silence that feels wrong in your bones. At first, silence can still feel explainable. Maybe they're asleep, maybe they're busy, maybe they stepped out for a minute. But when minutes stretch into a longer gap, normal explanations start to crumble. That's when their daughter, Romy, was contacted. Try to imagine what it feels like to get that call. Not a dramatic call, not a screaming call, just a simple, confusing message that says, "No one is answering." And then you're driving toward your parents' home, telling yourself it's nothing, trying to keep your mind calm, trying to keep your heart from sprinting ahead of the facts until you arrive. And then the worst possible version of reality is waiting for you inside. According to what has been reported, Romy entered the home and saw her father's body. She ran out, and the emergency call was made. That's the moment the story stops being a private worry and becomes a public event. First responders arrive, investigators follow. The house becomes a scene, not a home. The air turns heavy with questions no one can answer fast enough. Later, the medical examiner would rule the deaths homicides and describe multiple sharp force injuries. And that's where the timeline becomes even more haunting. The death certificates indicated both Rob and Michele died within minutes of being injured. They were found just 1 minute apart. 1 minute. That detail doesn't feel like information. It feels like a punch, because it forces you to confront how fast a life can end, how quickly a household can turn from normal to irreversible. and it raises a question that people whisper but rarely say out loud. Was there time for fear? Was there time for a plea? Was there time for a moment of recognition that the life they knew was ending? That's the kind of question that keeps people awake, because the answers live inside a house no longer filled with family warmth, but with evidence markers and forensic reports. And while the world was still absorbing the word homicide, the investigation moved with a speed that made the next headline even more explosive. Nick Reiner was located and arrested that same day near the USC area. Again, pause on that. Same day. That means authorities weren't just treating this as a tragedy. They were treating it as a case with urgency, with direction, with a person they believed they needed to find. And soon after, the charges came. 2 counts of first-degree murder. This is the part where people start reaching for a simple story. People want a clean narrative with a clean beginning. They want one argument, one trigger, one moment where everything makes sense. But the truth is, most family collapses don't announce themselves with one dramatic scene. They arrive in layers, in private tensions no one wants to admit exist, in unspoken resentments, in days where someone seems off, but you tell yourself they're just tired, in moments where you think, we'll talk about it later because later feels guaranteed, until later disappears. Right now, the public doesn't have a confirmed motive laid out in a neat paragraph, and that absence is exactly what makes a speculation spread like wildfire. But the court process doesn't run on rumor. It runs on what can be proven. And as January 7, 2026 get closer, the story is going to shift again, because arraignment is where the legal battle starts to take shape in a way the public can finally see. Right now, most people are still living inside the shock. 2 bodies, 1 home, a son charged. But the legal system doesn't run on shock. It runs on steps. And the next step is the one that starts turning this tragedy into a battle, line by line, fact by fact. January 7, 2026. That's the date set for Nick Reiner's arraignment. And if you've never followed a murder case before, arraignment sounds like a formality, a quick courtroom scene, a few minutes, then everyone goes home. But in a case like this, arraignment is the moment the story stops being a headline and becomes a legal identity, because that's where the charges are formally read. That's where a plea is entered. That's where the prosecution and defense begin shaping 2 completely different versions of reality. One side will be building a narrative of intent. The other side will be building a narrative of doubt, complexity, mental state, or circumstances the public doesn't yet understand. And this case has already been charged in a way that signals something important. Not just first-degree murder, but special circumstances. In California, special circumstances are not decoration. They are a statement of how severe prosecutors believe the case is. And when special circumstances are involved, the stakes rise to the highest level. It can mean a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. And in theory, it can also open the door to the death penalty, even though California has had a moratorium on executions for years, meaning executions are not currently being carried out. That tension matters because it creates a strange kind of reality where the law allows the harshest punishment, but the estate is not actually executing people. So the practical maximum often becomes life without parole. Still, the reason the public keeps reacting so intensely is simple. Special circumstances make this feel like the system is bracing for something brutal. And then there's the human side, the side the courtroom can't fully capture. Because while lawyers prepare and prosecutors line up evidence and documents begin to stack into a mountain, the family is trying to do something that feels impossible: grieve. Rob and Michele's children asked for privacy and compassion. They said a memorial would be held later. That sounds normal until you realize what it really means. They are mourning two parents, while the world watches, debates, and dissects every detail like it's entertainment. They're trying to hold on to dignity in a moment designed to strip it away. And the closer we get to January 7th, the more that dignity will be tested. Because arraignment is not the end, it's the opening door. After that can come hearings, motions, evidence fights, mental health evaluations, and decisions that will determine whether this ends in a plea deal, a trial, or a years-long war in court. And here's the most painful truth. Even if the public gets the motive someday, even if the case becomes understood, nothing will make it normal. Nothing will make it make sense in the way people want it to, because the central image will always remain the same. A home that should have been safe, two people who should have had more time, and a family now split into before and after with no bridge between the two. There's a reason stories like this spread faster than almost anything else. It isn't just because famous names are involved, it's because this kind of tragedy presses on a fear that lives inside almost everyone, even the people who pretend they're too tough to feel it. The fear that the people closest to you can become strangers. The fear that the home can turn into a place you don't recognize. The fear that love by itself is not always enough to stop the unthinkable. When the public hears a son charged with killing his parents, the mind immediately starts searching for an explanation the way your hand searches for a light switch in the dark. Because if there's no explanation, then the world feels unsafe. And if the world feels unsafe, people don't know where to put their trust. That's why the internet becomes a machine that manufactures answers when real answers aren't available yet. One person says it was mental illness, another says it was money, another says it was resentment, another says it was something hidden for years, and soon those guesses start sounding like facts simply because they've been repeated 1,000 times. But repetition doesn't make something true. It only makes it louder. And that's the part most people don't want to admit about modern tragedy. The algorithm doesn't care about truth. It cares about tension. It rewards certainty, even when certainty is fake. It rewards outrage, even when outrage destroys real people who are still alive and still bleeding. It rewards the sharpest theory, not the kindest reality. Meanwhile, the family is trying to do something quietly heroic. They're trying to keep their grief from being turned into a spectacle. They asked for privacy, for compassion, for space, not because they're hiding something, but because grief is not content. It's not a trending topic. It's a physical weight that makes people forget how to breathe. And there's a detail that almost never gets discussed, but it's the one that matters most. No matter what happens in court, the family loses. If Nick is found guilty, they lose their brother to a prison system and their parents to the grave. If Nick is found not guilty, they still lost their parents in a brutal way and will live under suspicion, confusion, and endless public judgment. If mental health is a key part of the case, they still have to carry the heartbreaking reality that the someone they loved may have been slipping away from reality long before anyone could stop it. There is no outcome where they get their old life back. That's why this story feels so heavy, because it forces people to confront the truth that families can fall apart without warning signs that the outside world can see. It forces people to imagine the final moments of two people who spent a lifetime building a home, only to have that home become the place they died. And it forces a question that is unbearable precisely because it is so human. What did love look like in that house in the last few months? Was it quiet and normal right up until the end? Or was it filled with tension no one outside could hear? We don't know yet. And that's why people keep watching. Because when the motive is unknown, the story becomes a mirror. Everyone projects their own fears into it. Parents see their children. Children see their parents. People with family pain see their own history. People with no family pain suddenly realize how fragile normal really is. After January 7th, this case won't feel like a shocking headline anymore. It will start to feel like a machine, a legal machine that moves forward whether the family is ready or not, whether the public understands or not, whether anyone's hearts can handle it or not. Because once a plea is entered, the court schedule becomes a calendar of pressure. There will be hearings, motions, arguments over evidence, arguments over what the jury is allowed to hear, arguments over what the public is allowed to see. And that's when the story often gets uglier, not because new violence happens, but because details begin to surface in pieces, not as a full picture. A document leaks, a line in a report gets repeated out of context. A rumor becomes a headline becomes a fact to people who never read past the first sentence. And every time that happens, the family has to relive the loss all over again. Because they don't get to consume this story, they have to live inside it. Now, in cases this severe, the prosecution will typically focus on proving intent and planning because the charge is first-degree murder and special allegations have already been filed. They will want the court and eventually a jury to believe this wasn't confusion, this wasn't chaos, this wasn't a moment that spun out of control. They will aim for a narrative that is cold, clear, and deliberate. Meanwhile, the defense may push in a different direction. They may challenge how evidence was collected. They may challenge what can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. They may argue that the public's assumptions are swallowing the facts. And if mental health becomes central, the court could see arguments about competency, evaluations, and what Nick was capable of understanding at the time. That's where the words complex and serious issues stop sounding like a vague statement and start sounding like the reality of what this could become. Because once mental health enters a case, the public tends to split into tribes. One side shouts, "That's an excuse." The other side shouts, "That's the explanation." And the truth is often far more painful than either side wants to admit. Because an explanation doesn't erase a loss, and a loss doesn't prove a motive. But here's the part most people don't understand until they watch a case like this unfold. Even when the public gets more information, they rarely get closure. They get fragments. They get arguments. They get two opposing stories fighting for dominance, each one designed to persuade, not necessarily to heal. And in the middle of that, there are two people who can't speak for themselves anymore. Rob Reiner, Michele Singer Reiner. No new evidence, no legal strategy, no courtroom victory can restore their voices, their presence, their ordinary days. And the tragedy isn't just that they died, it's that their last chapter will now be written by strangers in suits, by reporters, by commentators, by people who never sat at their table, never heard their laughter, never knew the private tenderness that exists inside a long marriage. That's why the children's request for privacy is so heartbreaking, because it's the smallest, most human request in a world that punishes humans for being human. They're basically saying, please, don't turn our parents into a spectacle. And yet, the closer the case gets to major court moments, the harder that becomes, because the public will keep asking the same questions. What happened inside that house? Why it happened? And whether anything could have stopped it before it reached this point. There's a cruel pattern in tragedies like this. When the story first breaks, everyone wants a single moment they can point to. One argument, one phone call, one last straw, something simple enough that it makes the world feel orderly again. But most families who lived through something catastrophic will tell you the same thing. It almost never feels like a single moment while it's happening. It feels like small shifts, a mood that changes, a silence that lasts longer, a relationship that becomes harder to read, a person who starts drifting from the version of themselves you remember, but not in a way dramatic enough to scream danger, just enough to make you say, they're going through something, just enough to make you hope it'll pass, and hope is powerful. Hope can keep a family together, but hope can also become the reason people delay the hard conversations, because facing reality feels like betrayal. And that's why this story hits people in the gut, because it forces an uncomfortable thought into the room. What if the warning signs were there, but they didn't look like warnings at the time? What if they looked like a stress, or conflict, or withdrawal, or the kind of behavior families learn to normalize, because acknowledging it would mean admitting something is breaking? It's easy for strangers to judge from a distance, but inside a family, love changes the way you interpret everything. Love makes you give the benefit of the doubt. Love makes you forgive more than you should. Love makes you cling to the best version of someone, even when the present version is slipping away. And again, we have to be careful here. We do not know the private details of the Reiners' day-to-day life leading up to December 14th. We do not know what was said behind closed doors. We do not know what was tried, what was ignored, what was hidden, what was feared, what was hoped. But the emotional truth remains the same for anyone watching. When something this unthinkable happens, people don't just ask, why did it happen? They ask, could it happen to me? And then they start scanning their own lives like a detective. They replay old conversations. They reread old messages. They remember moments that once felt minor and suddenly feel like alarms. And that's when this story becomes bigger than celebrity. It becomes a reminder that families are not immune to darkness, not because families are bad, but because families are human, and humans can suffer in ways that don't announce themselves with neat warning labels. The tragedy here is layered. There is the legal tragedy where a son stands accused and two parents are gone. There's the emotional tragedy where the people left behind will spend the rest of their lives carrying a grief that never gets a clean ending. And there is the public tragedy where strangers will fight over this story like it belongs to them, while a real family is trying to survive something that most people can't even imagine. This is why the children's request for privacy matters so much. Because while the world wants details, they want dignity. While the world wants theories, they want peace. While the world wants to understand, they are still in the raw unlivable stage of loss. And now, as January 7th approaches, the story will shift again. From grief to procedure, from shock to argument, from headlines to transcripts. And that's where the next chapter begins. So here's where this story stands right now. Without the noise, without the internet adding extra shadows. Rob Reiner and Michele Reiner were found dead inside their home in Brentwood. Their deaths were ruled homicides. Reports say a massage therapist arrived, couldn't get an answer, and their daughter, Romy, was contacted. She went to the home, discovered her father, ran out, and the emergency call followed. Nick Reiner, their 32-year-old son, was arrested that same day near the USC area. He has been charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, with allegations that raise the stakes even higher, and the next major courtroom milestone is set for January 7th, 2026. That is the reality, as confirmed by what has been publicly reported so far. Everything else people are arguing about online, the theories, the motives, the confident opinions, the dramatic, I know what really happened energy, all of that is not the story. It's just noise sitting on top of grief. Because the real story is simpler, and that's why it's so hard to hold. 2 people are gone. A son is now at the center of a case that will likely stretch out for months, maybe years. And the family left behind is trying to grieve in a world that doesn't know how to let grief be private anymore. What makes this case feel different, even to people who never followed Rob Reiner's career, is the contrast. 1 minute, you're thinking about a home, a marriage, a long life. The next minute, you're reading words like homicide, knife, first-degree murder, special circumstances, arraignment. It feels like a tear in reality. And maybe that's why it's so important to remember one thing before we leave this story. We can want answers without turning pain into entertainment. We can follow updates without turning a family's collapse into a sport. We can talk about what is known without pretending we know everything. Because there's a difference between truth and thirst. And right now, the only people who truly deserve gentleness are the ones who have to wake up every day and realize this is not a headline for them. It is their life. If you're watching this and you have parents, call them. If you're watching this and you have children, look at them for a second longer. Not because fear should run your life, but because life is fragile in a way we only understand when it's already too late. And as this case moves toward January 7th, the world will keep watching. But no matter what comes out next, no matter what a courtroom decides, the most heartbreaking truth will stay the same. Rob and Michele don't get to come back, and a family that once had a private home now has a public nightmare.